Hi there. I was requested to take a look biblically at what God's point of view of modesty is. It gets a lot of opinions and cultural effects depending on where you live, what part of the U.S. you live in, and what part of the world. It surely impacts what the concept of modesty is. But I want to look at what is the Bible's point of view of what a woman wears and what about a woman constitutes being modest. So we want to record this and just put it out there for you to look at. And I encourage you to get your Bible and follow along with these scriptures and study them for yourselves. But as we go into this, I do want to open with prayer, so I invite you to pray with me. Holy Father Yahweh, thank you so much for your love. Thank you for your persistence to teach us, to grow us, and shape us, and mold us more and more into your image. I thank you for those who watch this video, Father, that they have a desire to honor you with their dress and with true modesty. Father, I pray that you direct this conversation, that it would be holy and pleasing to you, Father. Thank you that you love us enough to reveal yourself, to reveal your nature, and to reveal your desires for us as your children, as your daughters. And as always, Father, I ask that the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart would be pleasing and acceptable in your sight, O Yahweh, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. All right. So let's get started with just a concept of modesty. I was raised in the South in Bible Belt typical church in the 60s and early 70s. And in my culture, it was one of those things that women did not wear pants to church. There was something wrong with you if you did, and it was frowned on. And there things like that. And yet other parts of the country, pants are not a big deal for women to wear in settings and all. And ideas evolve and such, and the culture evolves. And today, there is such an impact from what the TV, the movie screen, all the social media, that what they tell you. And there is a barrage, there's an attack on women uh, who that challenges them not to get their value of who they are from within or from what their creator says about them, but from the media. Hollywood tells you that you've got to always be beautiful, always have your makeup and your hair just perfect, and you always have to wear these little slinky outfits that show off every curve and all, that unless you are attractive sexually, you're not really a woman. There is so much of that that is just perpetrated. And if our daughters grow up with that, folks, if you just let the media dump all that viewpoint into your children's minds through TV, through Disney Channel, through movies, there's so many places that will shape them and mold them and tell them that the to be acceptable and to really be worth something, they have to be physically beautiful. They have to not only be physically beautiful, but they have to be sexually alluring. And that without a sexual perspective to the way that a woman presents herself, she's not really a woman, or there's something wrong with her. And that is so far off from what God's view of his daughters is designed to be. So I want to take a little bit of time just to look at 5 different scripture passages that kind of give you an overview. And I'm going to share the screen, and but basically, let me get the screen shared. I want to point out that as this meme says, modesty isn't about hiding your body. It's about revealing your dignity. There are some concepts of modesty that say you have to cover everything from your neck to your ankles and everything in between. There are some religious cultures in the Middle East, as you know, that a woman is not supposed to show anything but barely her eyes, and anything beyond that is considered immodest and immoral. That is so far from the Father's point of view. Let's start with Proverbs 31. A lot of us are familiar with this passage. It talks about the Proverbs 31 woman. And I have in our Bible Explorer group, I did post a teaching by Frank Seekins about Proverbs 31. I highly encourage you to take time to go listen to that. He covers it with a lot more skill and a lot more depth than I am coming anywhere near. And it is a powerful message. I've listened to it several times because it is so uplifting and so enlightening and so empowering to women. But first of all, take a look, because so much of the Bible is written by men. But if you look, Proverbs 31 is based on the words of King Lemuel's mother, which would have been Bathsheba. King Lemuel was one of the names that was used for Solomon, David's son, and Bathsheba's son. So this, you think about it, who can correct a king? Well, probably his mother is about the only one. So the Queen Regent would be a title for her today. But these are actually the words of his mother to him. So that makes them pretty unique, I think, in most of the Bible. Uh, let's take a look at this. Excuse me. She's addressing, listen to my son, or listen, my son, listen, son of my womb, listen, my son, the answer to my prayers. She's like, son, listen, listen, listen. And she starts out, don't spend your strength. That word is hayel, and it means strength. It also means your wealth and your power too. But don't pour everything out on women. Your vigor on those who ruin kings. And she goes on and gives some advice that not to drink, that kings need to, in particular, need to have their thoughts and their wits about them. And if you drink, you won't be able to judge well. And also there's an admonition to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. This is something that is so important to Yahweh. He places such high value and actually describes true religion as those who take care of the widow and the fatherless. Taking care of the destitute is such a high priority. We are not supposed to be blind to those things at all. We are supposed to be aware of what's going on in our world and doing what we can to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves and to defend the rights of the poor and needy. So she moves from that of don't be drunker, the speak up for those who can't speak for themselves, in other words, judge rightly. And then she goes on, a wife of noble character, who can find? And this is NIV, which isn't always the best translation, but noble character is a wife of Hayil, that same word that we saw translated strength. So this is actually a mighty woman, a woman of valor, a virtuous woman. Now, I think King James says virtuous, but one thing you'll discover in the Frank Seekins teaching, in the 1600s, when the King James translation was written, virtuous meant powerful. So a powerful woman, a strong woman, who can find? She's worth far more than rubies. Her husband has full confidence in her and lacks nothing of value. She brings him good, not harm, all the days of her life. God's design for women, particularly as a wife, but women in general, when you marry, You see this, her husband has full confidence in her. He knows, he has no question of her loyalty to him, that she only has eyes for him. This is a powerful woman who has chosen her husband. And because of her, he lacks nothing of value. And then verse 12 again says she brings him good, not harm, all the days of her life. So this godly woman is going to lift up her husband. He totally trusts in her. You think this powerful woman, this is a warrior queen to fight by his side. He knows that she has his back no matter what. And so his heart can safely trust in her. And there's other descriptions over. I'm not going to go in that today. But one of the things, her clothing, in verse 25, she is clothed with strength and dignity. She can laugh at the days to come. Again, there's nothing about particular clothing. The things that are reckoned of value are inner value, strength and dignity. And then I want to come down to the bottom. 28. Her children arise and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praises her. Many women do noble things, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceptive and beauty is fleeting, but a woman who fears Yahweh is to be praised. Honor her for all that her hands have done, and let her works bring her praise at the city gate. This woman understands that outward appearances are not the things that are eternal. Outward appearances are not the things that matter most. A woman who fears Yahweh, she is to be praised. And because of that, that's why her husband can safely trust in her. To continue that idea of inner beauty, hang on just a moment. Yeah, let me go to I want to go to 1 Peter chapter 3. And again, in my culture, that was the verses here that sometimes get taken a little bit out of context. So it starts out in chapter 3. This is Peter writing to believers. Wives, in the same way, submit yourself to your own husbands. All right, let's back up. In the same way. In the same way as what? Okay, let's go back to the previous chapter to get the context. To 1 Peter chapter 2. And let me go toward the second half of chapter 2. Basically, he's speaking generally to believers about living godly lives. In verse 12, live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify Elohim on the day he visits us. And here's a word, submit. So he says, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake, for Yahweh's sake, to every human authority, whether to the emperor as a supreme authority or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and commend those to do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. So here we're told to submit for Yahweh's sake, for the Lord's sake, to the human authorities that he has allowed over us. And that would be law enforcement and our governors and our president and such. That if, as a godly, obedient Christian, not because those authorities might be good or not, but for the Lord's sake, to submit ourselves to them. And then, down in verse 18, slaves, in reverent fear of Elohim, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. So here, slaves are told to submit to their masters because they fear Yahweh, not necessarily because their masters are good or bad. Now, we don't have, in this country, don't have slaves in that direct sense, but we do have employees and employers. So you could take that same concept that because you fear and honor God, submit to your boss, and basically to do well as best you can, regardless of not whether they are good or bad, but because you fear God. And so you have these two commands to submit, to submit to authorities, and because for Yahweh's sake, and to submit to your bosses, your employees or employers or masters, because you fear Elohim. So now let's go back to chapter 3. So he's saying, in the same way, so wives, because you fear Yahweh, and for Yahweh's sake, submit yourself to your own husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives, when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. Okay, so that there is the instruction. In other words, not for your husband's sake, because he's a wonderful husband, but because you fear and love and honor Yahweh, that you would choose to submit. Now, please, I'm not saying anything about staying in an abusive relationship. That is not the context here. Okay, but this is where you are in a marriage, but maybe you didn't know any better and married an unbeliever, or you were both unbelievers when you got married, and later you got saved and he hasn't. The idea is that for the Lord's sake, stay married to that person and hope that your life can be a testimony to him. And we touched on divorce and remarriage in the Bible in a previous study. So if you have comments down below and want to ask questions, please do that. But that's not the main point of what I'm reading here today. I want to focus especially on verse 3. Your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as elaborate hairstyles and the wearing of gold jewelry or fine clothes. Rather, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in Elohim's sight. For this is the way the holy women of the past, who put their hope in Elohim, used to adorn themselves. Okay, so he's saying, understand, this is like the Proverbs 31 woman, that she's clothed in strength and dignity. Here he's telling, Peter's encouraging wives, understand that your beauty comes from within, your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit. Those things last long after the young skin has passed away and the wrinkles have shown up. Those are the things that matter. Now, notice he is not saying don't wear jewelry, don't have elaborate hairstyles or fine clothes, but he's saying don't look to that to be your source of beauty. Understand that the beauty that God created us to have comes from within, to be that woman of valor, that woman of strength, to be clothed in strength and dignity, to be a woman that's honorable enough that your husband can safely trust in her. And I use the example of the verse in Timothy that says the love of money is the root of all evil. Well, some people just take the second part. Oh, money's evil, and you can't be really spiritual if you've got lots of money, because it'll sidetrack you. But that's not what it says. I use the example of Abraham. Abram was called out. Abram was extremely wealthy. And when you read in Genesis, there was a time, if you remember, he had his nephew Lot, who divided from him and went and lived down by Sodom and Gomorrah. And there were some kings that came and attacked that area and kidnapped Lot and all his family and a lot of other people from that area and took them off. Abram at that time, later renamed Abraham, went, took his men and went and beat, whooped those kings, and retrieved his nephew and all the other people and all the other belongings, and took them back to the king of Sodom. When he met the king there, the king said, "Here, take your share of the booty. I mean, you've earned it." And Abram said, "No, my men can take their portion, and Lot takes his stuff, but I won't take a single sandal string, because I will not allow any man to ever say I made Abraham rich, that only Yahweh is the one who made me rich." So Abram was extremely wealthy. I mean, you read he had horses and camels and donkeys and sheep and cattle and gold. I mean, he was extremely wealthy man. But he understood that his wealth did not come from the stuff. His wealth came from Yahweh. And therefore, it was fine for him to have all the wealth. It wasn't his focus. So please look at this, ladies, when you read this. It is not saying there's anything wrong with outward adornment or styling your hair or wearing jewelry or nice clothes. But if you're looking for that to be your source of beauty, and you don't feel like you're beautiful unless you have all the trappings on the outside, you've missed the point, because true beauty comes from within. And let's see, let me see if I can find this. If you go, well, okay, let me type this in. Excuse me just a moment. I want to go to Genesis 24, and this is actually toward the end of Abraham's life, at the time that he sends his servant Eliezer to go find a wife for his son, his only son Isaac. And he tells him I want you to go, don't take a wife among the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I'm living, but I want you to go back to my country and to my own relatives and get a wife for Isaac. So they make this agreement, and so Eleazar, his servant, takes 10 of his master's camels, and he takes gifts and such, and he goes back. It's about 500 miles travel back to the land that Abraham came from. And as he goes, as the servant arrives at the town, he comes to the spring, and he prays a prayer saying, "Father, let the young lady who comes, who gives me a drink and freely offers to water my camels, let her be the one you have chosen." And so he sees Rebecca. She's the first one, and he comes to her, and she fulfills his prayer. She gives him drink, and she says, "I'll water your camels too." Which, if you think about it, a camel, I've read, can drink anywhere from 25 to 30 gallons of water at a go. If you think she has a 5-gallon water jar, and she had to draw 25 gallons times 10, that's 250 gallons. That's 25 jars of water. And yet she said, "I'll water your camels until they're done drinking." So Eleazar's watching her. And so for her kindness, he pays her, and he says he gave her a gold nose ring weighing a beka and 2 gold bracelets weighing 10 shekels. Those are some big bracelets. So here you have, excuse me, a young lady who is wearing a nose ring and golden bracelets. So she's wearing jewelry, and she's going to become one of the wives of the patriarchs. So it's a beautiful story, and I encourage you to read the whole chapter. But he then finds out she's actually from Abraham's relatives, so he knows then that his prayer has been answered. So he goes back, and that's where Rebecca came from. But I wanted to point out there was nothing wrong with her wearing a nose ring or wearing bracelets. So when you go back and you read in Peter, again, he's not saying don't wear those things, but don't find your beauty from them. And just as Rebecca showed that she had a gracious heart, she'd already demonstrated who she was on the inside to Eleazar. The jewelry on the outside didn't it didn't make her valuable. The fact that she was so giving and generous, that is what made her such a beautiful and valuable young woman for the kingdom. Um, so, uh, ladies, understand who you are, but if you want to wear your jewelry, go right ahead. But don't look at it to be that I can't be beautiful unless I have my earrings and my nose rings and my necklaces and everything else. So let's look at one more. This is Deuteronomy 22, actually verse 5 we're going to look at. This is a verse that has gotten used. Again, in the way I was brought up, that as understanding why it wasn't right for women to wear pants. And it says very simply, a woman must not wear men's clothing. That's what this translation says. We're going to look a little further. Nor a man wear woman's clothing, for Yahweh your Elohim detests anyone who does this. Now, so that was used to say, see, a woman shouldn't wear pants. But I always thought it was interesting. The guy that wrote this would be wearing what we call a dress at the time. So could it be there's something more? And indeed there is. Because if we look at this verse a little bit better, I want to go to the interlinear. And even if you don't read Hebrew, that's okay. I don't read it very well at all, but we need to look at it. Okay, Hebrew reads from the right to left, not left to right. So, not shall wear anything that pertains to a man. Now, anything that pertains to is actually articles, utensils, and vessels. Okay? It's really not referring. It's used once to refer to clothing. It's the vast time, a majority of times, it has to do with wearing armor. It has to do with vessels. It has to do with weapons. If you look at how many times it appears and translate it that way, there's only one time it's translated to refer to clothing. So, let's go back and let's look at the next word. So, do not wear vessels or armor that pertains to, and this word geber, usually the word for man is ish, and geber is another word that can mean man, but it also can mean warrior, which makes sense when he's saying don't wear anything that pertains to a man. Don't wear any armor or articles or vessels that pertain to a man. So this is actually more of an idea of don't put a woman shouldn't be wearing a man's armor. In other words, don't take on the office of a man. Now, down the second half of that verse says, now man shall not put on a garment. There it specifically is referring to a garment of a woman. And there's a typical word for woman is isha. The word for man is ish and isha. So it's interesting they use a typical word for woman, but for man they use the word not ish, but the word that can mean a soldier. So understand this is talking a little bit more than just an article of clothing. In fact, Kali doesn't even usually refer to clothing. It refers to other things. So, ladies, that doesn't mean You still need to dress so you look like a lady, but you also don't need to put on um, garments of war with that. And part of that comes from the idea that women are to be protected, that it's the man's duty, is should be the one that fights the battles to protect you. But this verse has gotten used so many times to refer, uh, to be a way to say you don't wear, women don't wear pants. But an actual better thing would be, I know you've probably heard the saying of when people see a bossy wife or something, they say, well, we know who wears the pants in that family. That the concept is that the woman is taking authority that God didn't mean for her to have. He meant there to be a balance. The man is the one that answers to to Yahweh, and he answers also for whether or not he takes care of his wife there. So just another thing. And one last verse I want to go to is in First Corinthians. And the first few verses there is talking about covering the head in worship. And it is basically, it says a woman who should cover her head, particularly when she prays or prophesies in public. Now, prophecy, if you look up what it means to prophesy, that includes to teach, admonish, encourage, exhort, and speak under divine inspiration, as well as to foretell. And so when people take a couple of other verses and say that say a woman should be silent, actually just 3 chapters later, it's kind of contradicting. Paul goes to this into detail to say the proper way for a woman to pray or prophesy in public is with her head covered, which is kind of interesting. I use the example of why, if you're not supposed to do it at all, there's no need to discuss the proper or improper way to do something. It's like, what's the proper way to be a prostitute? Well, you're not supposed to do it at all, so there's no need to discuss the right or wrong way. And so he says that a woman should do it with her head covered. Okay, and that's those first verses. So let me go back. And the thing with the head covering that I had been asked actually to study this out a while back, and I wanted my teaching to be godly and decent in line with God's word. And so I saw this and saw that, well, it's okay for women to pray and prophesy in public. So what do you do with the two verses, one in 1 Corinthians 14, and there's one in Paul's letter to Timothy, where he says a woman should not speak. And I was trying to understand this, and actually I contacted 3 Bible teachers that I have known for years and highly respect. One is Rico Cortez, one is Brad Scott, and the other is Matthew Vander Els. I encourage you to find their teachings on YouTube because they're all really good, a lot better than mine and a lot more thorough. And I was asking them, what am I missing? Because I see Paul speaking of how a woman does this in public. I see Paul in Romans 16 exalting Phoebe as a deaconess and also as a prostatus, who is mean, and that word means a woman in authority. And it said she's been a woman in authority over me. Listen to what she says and do everything she asks. He praises Junia as an apostle, also in Romans 16. So I'm like, what am I missing here? Because in these verses, it seems like it's okay. And all 3 of these gentlemen that I spoke with, and I value their opinion because they have such a knowledge, all 3 of them pointed out that all of Paul's letters are written to congregations that are part of the Roman Empire. So you need to know what the Roman culture was of that day. And this is actually more of a cultural thing, because In the Roman culture, a married woman, you would have a Roman man would marry a woman that would be the mother of his children, that carry on his name and such. And that was the married woman. She was responsible for bearing children and running the house. But a lot of times, then they also had a different woman that was their escort service girl that would go with them out in public places. A married woman properly had her head covered, and the uncovered head meant that you were an escort who was available for hire, or basically a temple prostitute. And that's some of what where Paul in 1 Corinthians 11. I'm not going to go back to it, but read that passage, the first 16 verses of that chapter. Paul goes on and says, if you're going to have your head uncovered, you might as well shave your hair. Because and if you understand the context, that was the way that the temple prostitutes identified themselves. So if you saw a woman with short hair, she was advertising that she was available for hire. She had her head uncovered. She was advertising that she was available. So Paul is saying, don't look like a prostitute, ladies. Again, remember the Proverbs 31 woman. She is clothed with strength and dignity. Don't present yourself as something you're not. Present yourself with strength and dignity, that you are a godly woman, by wearing a head covering in that culture. Now, in our culture today, head coverings don't carry that same message. There's other things that might identify somebody as being a prostitute. And also, you typically don't have men who have their wives and then their escort girls. So it's not the same sort of thing in our culture today. But again, understand who you are. And so I want to conclude with the idea that we are called to understand who we are, and especially as daughters of the King. I want you to realize that modesty isn't just about a dress code. It's an attitude of the heart. The Proverbs 31 woman understands that. She knows there's nothing about her appearance. Every description of her is about who she is on the inside. She's a powerful woman. She's a strong woman. She is someone in whom her husband can safely trust. That means she's a woman of integrity. She's clothed in strength and dignity. She understands that beauty is fleeting, but the things that matter are a heart that fears Yahweh. Remember what Peter told the church? He said, women, understand your inner beauty. Understand that. We need to have the attitude of the heart. And I want to share one last little meme with you, because I thought it was so good. The way I choose to dress or act does not give anyone else the right to think less of me or to assign me any less dignity, but it does provide the rest of the world a glimpse into the way in which I view myself. So, ladies, I would ask you, how do you view yourself? Where do you get your sense of self-worth? Do you understand how precious and valuable and cherished you are by your Heavenly Father? That He made you specially in His image to reflect His nature to the world. And He wants you to understand who He says you are. He wants you to view yourself the way He views you. Not the way Hollywood and television and social media, not with their value system, because their value system is skewed by the enemy, and it's built on a lie that your value is just from what's on the outside. It's always been a matter of the heart. Serving the Father, belonging to the Father, has always been a matter of the heart. Moses told Israel in the wilderness in Deuteronomy 30, he said, the words I've told you today are not that hard, but they're near you and in your heart, that you may love God and do them. And Yeshua, the Word made flesh, said it pretty much the same way. In John 14:15, he said, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. It won't be a burden to obey me because you love me. It's always been a matter of love. And if I love my Father and I see myself the way he sees me, then I can love myself. And so the way I dress will be designed to reveal my inner dignity, because that's the way in which I view myself. And that's the way he wants you to view yourself, because that's the sort of woman who is a mighty woman, and who is one in whom her husband can safely trust. And a wise husband will realize what an incredible jewel he has, and that your worth is far above rubies. So, ladies, value yourself. Modesty comes from within. The outward adornment, there's nothing wrong with it if it's just outward adornment and it's not your identity. Your identity comes from who he has said you are. And that is one incredibly special and precious and dearly loved daughter of the King. Thank you so much. Y'all have a blessed week.